Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, Flora Samuel, Professor of Architecture at Cambridge University, speaks about her book, Housing for Hope and Wellbeing, published by Routledge in January this year.
I think that spiritual experience is completely excluded from architectural culture. And I think that this is, in this day and age, although there's definitely a change happening. And I think that this is very excluding of many, many different kinds of peoples who do adhere to some spiritual framework in their life. So I think this sort of totally unspiritualness of architecture culture is actually bordering on getting quite racist in some ways, and can be very, very negative for experience of student architects and things like that.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Flora Samuel. Professor, would you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, hello there. Yes, so I'm Flora Samuel. My official role in life is Professor of Architecture 1970 at Cambridge University, which is a special role in that its first incumbent was Leslie Martin, and then it was Bill Howe. Mm-hmm. And then it was Collins and John Wilson, and then it was Peter Carolyn, and then it was Alan Short, and then it's me. So it's a sort of role with a history where you talk about who had it. So I look forward to being part of the historical layers of the role. And things seem to be done a bit differently in Cambridge, so that's what it is. So
you've been at Reading for how long? Because you're at Reading, and I was reading your biography on the Cambridge Architecture website about the announcement of your becoming chair there. And how long were you at Reading for?
I've been at Reading for 7.5 years. I went there to start a new school of architecture, which is a very industry-led, practice research-led school of architecture. And before
how does that go on? Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's just before that I was at head at Sheffield.
Uh-huh.
And so that, I mean, I've learned so much in all the different roles.
Yeah, I bet. It must be quite an exciting opportunity. So where did you study? You studied to be an architect. You're not a theorist, you're not a historian.
No, I'm an architect. I studied at Cambridge myself, and I absolutely hated it and was very critical of the whole thing. I think that's possibly what got me into architectural education.
Yeah.
I went to Princeton for a while, and that was likewise really difficult.
What was so bad about it? This was in the 1980s.
Yes, I mean, I asked myself, was it me or was it the place? It was real Me Too time, it was really exploitative and strange times. Mm. And postmodernism architecture was not, it was a really dismal time for architecture, postmodernism and high tech. Mm. I personally found it. And at Princeton, it was with Michael Graves, and it was all very, very, his idea of an insult with one of my projects was describing it as looking like an alto. That was an insult, and that was painful to me if somebody had been brought up as alto is God, really. So it was a weird and strange time to be training as an architect, and to be a female training as an architect too.
Yeah, I imagine. Sort of vaguely can imagine. So you went to work in practice after that?
Yeah, I worked for a while in practice, not tremendously long, in refurbishing council estates. Well, that was the time when Mrs. Thatcher was starting to sell them all off, so it was privatizing chunks of them, I guess. Yeah. And then also the kind of gold tap variety of domestic work for very rich clients. And I had a little practice of my own for a little while, but it was all incredibly difficult. And then I had my first daughter. Being in practice is just grim. So yeah, it was that. I mean, the thing that got me really going back to, I got a little gig working at South Bank, which was Women into Architecture. It was kind of an access program, and it was really fascinating. And I was tried teaching history on that and discovered how, oh my goodness, the history I'd been taught was so inappropriate to a bunch of women who were going into architecture from all sorts of diverse backgrounds. So that really fired me up. So all of that got me out of practice and back into academia. I love learning anyway, so that's great.
But it's a kind of lovely segue into why we're talking today, which is this rather fabulous book that you've written, Houses for Hope and Wellbeing, which is published this year. Published this year or the end of last year?
Oh, it was actually published on the 20th of December last year.
There you go, Christmas present time. It's a really beautiful book, but and it's a really timely book, I think. And I've been thinking about it a lot over the last while in relation to, in a weird kind of way, my own situation. So I have a young family, and I teach at university and I have lots of education, as much as you can get, almost. And I live in a house that was built for Victorian workers, and it's very small. And it seems a bit weird.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's a very nice house. They're very well designed. They're they're built like the worst construction ever. As soon as you take the lath and plaster down, you're just left with a kind of sea of bricks and incredibly powdery mortar. But they are very, it's a great shape, but it's small. And I think a lot of us find ourselves in this condition now. If we're lucky enough to get a house at all, we find ourselves in a condition where it really isn't appropriate for stage in life, for, in a weird kind of way, the effort we've put in. I know that sounds incredibly envious, but certainly it isn't conducive for many people to these two amazing sort of like overlapping concepts of well-being and hope that you touch on. So I was just wondering if we could start by, if you could tell me about, or tell us about the motivations behind this book. Where does it come from in your own research, and what drives it?
Yes, well, I mean, the book is really a manifesto, and there are three things that really inspired me to write it, and I completely relate to all the things you were saying. I mean, I think there is an underlying, four things. I mean, I suppose my role as activist in my own community, and seeing how powerless the community is to have any sort of impact on their places, how unjust the whole system is, really. But I think I never understood, and I used to wonder to myself, why is it I just don't understand what housing is? I don't understand the housing delivery journey. There are all these black holes and mysterious places in it that I just haven't got a clue about. I've been in this business a long time. So I just wanted to sort of describe the complexity and obfuscation of the whole housing delivery journey, so that people could actually start understanding it and critiquing it and getting angry about different parts of it, because there's so much in it to get angry about, so they can demand improvements. And I think the other one is, I mean, my research is generally around this thing of social value, loosely speaking, well-being. And I've worked in housing research a long time, and it's completely dominated by economists. I mean, in line with the fact that we live in a very monetary value-based system, neoliberal system. So I wanted to get to explore and get across the thing that there are other kinds of value than money, and actually even those other kinds of value, if you use them properly, probably have a lot of monetary value in their own way. Giving people terrible housing obviously has huge knock-on effects on the national health system, but it's a different budget and a different bunch of people leading it. So it was one thing about offering a resistance to housing's obsession with economic value, really. And I just also wanted to write a book about housing that wasn't terribly dusty and just terribly I just wanted to write a book that I want to explore. I've always wanted to write one of these kind of non-fiction for a general audience. It's very hard for an academic to get in a gig in that zone. So I was starting to explore more around personal observation, personal thoughts and feelings as well in the narrative as I went along. So I wanted to write a book that people who from a bigger diversity of backgrounds than would, well, quite a big diversity of backgrounds might see themselves in it somewhere. Rather than just ignored or not mentioned. So yeah, I wanted to write a book that was more about housing, that was a bit more inclusive than the usual one.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that comes over very much. And I like this use of this word manifesto. And it does feel like a manifesto. There's a huge amount of data, which is data that people can access themselves. That's used to underpin it. And that, I think, is really good. It's not a sort of bank of kind of speculative data produced through obscure research methodologies necessarily, but it's kind of a collation of a number of points bringing together. And so it has that kind of energy about it. And you're right, I think it does read like doesn't read like an academic. I mean, it's obviously very academic. God, you get yourself into sticky situations when you're trying to compliment people, but trying.
I'm happy not to be academic, really.
But I think because the crisis to hand. So the book is split into these two sections, really, isn't it? It's book of two halves. It's describing the condition and then describing a possible alternative, and looking and describing the kind of green shoots of that alternative emerging.
Yes, that's a good way of describing it. I spend very little time on the problems because everybody knows them so well. It's more about the green shoots. Yeah,
and so it has that. But I said in my notes to you that it felt quite modernist in that way, and I think that's quite interesting that you study under Michael Graves, sick and tired of postmodernism, and produce something that has this kind of feel of an early 20th century, well, not early 20th, mid 20th century text, which is like they often did. People from that period, architects from that period, has that feeling of a kind of social obligation about it, like it's trying to do something.
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, I was thinking about what you said about that, and I mean, modernism is so misrepresented. I mean, this is why I wrote 5 books on Le Corbusier, to try and sort of put the record right on him, but a little bit. I think, I mean, Le Corbusier was beginning to get into consultation and diversity in his work. I wrote a book on him being a feminist because he was very interested in that stuff. But they didn't have, what we have now, which is access to data, and there wasn't this wide recognition of the incredible importance of recognizing different people's subjectivities in the way that you move forward. So a lot of, I suppose, modernists, and they didn't have the techniques to uncover those things as well. I mean, one of the ideas behind the book is it's not as difficult as it was to find out what impacts on it well-being. It used to be really difficult, but there's a sort of cohesive and growing body of stuff that really, we can build on. So
what does that stuff
like modernism in that it's idealistic, I say, that believes in a better future. I believe in that a better future is possible, but it's different because it's got around data, and it's around diversity, and it's around co-production, I would say, which is a bit distinct.
Around co-production?
Yeah, well, more around co-production of environments. But it's about, ultimately, I mean, the underpinning of it is this idea of the capabilities approach, that if you maximize people's ability to expand their own capabilities, what their potential is, what they want to be, that is the sort of underpinning idea that's what we need to do. We need to maximize people's capabilities so that they can develop into their fullest and best selves, in a sense.
So the idea, gosh, I don't want to sort of sum it up in a tweet, but the idea is that through better design of systems of governance, including planning and so on, and also of design, we would create a kind of framework which enabled communities to better participate in the production of their homes, in the kind of Eleanor Ostrom co-production kind of way.
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. I wouldn't want to overplay the role. Well, back in the 70s, modernist architect Scott so attacked for being determinist, for overclaiming that the impact of the built environment on people's lives. And undoubtedly, having enough money to eat is more important than having a nice house. But I think we can also underplay the importance of our environment and our neighborhoods, because particularly in the way that they enable connection with other people. If you're looking back to the capabilities approach, if just enabling people to connect with somebody different can radically change somebody's whole way of life, and open up new avenues that they never thought possible. So, yeah, I don't want to overplay what the built environment can do, but so much of the built environment stopping all of this, stopping people being their, what they would like to be or what they would like to do. Or
could you give an example of this? Could you give an example perhaps of, I think when architects speak of this, I think other architects hear them talking about volume house built suburbia, which is an obvious case in point, in a way, car dependent communities which militate against sociality and so on. But are there examples in cities where this is going on as well? Is it uniquely a suburbanite problem, or is it a generalized problem? Is it entirely to do with the procurement of buildings? Like, doesn't really matter where you build them. The procurement ensures that this kind of unhealthiness is evident within them.
I think it's, we have a loneliness pandemic, as it's been called. So wherever you are, I think this situation arises, and procurement is not set up to make good places for people in any shape or form, or particularly the planning system is not set up for them. So yeah, it can happen anywhere.
So what is it, do you think, about the planning system specifically, if we're taking a kind of co-productive view of it? What is it about the planning system that you understand, that is problematic?
Well, the planning system's completely broken. As the Royal Town Planning Institute have done many reports about this. They're just at the coalface of just trying to get, it's a bit like going to the doctor at the moment. You can't get in time or any sensible decision. Nobody's got very few people have got any design training. They're not being strategic. They've been cut and cut and cut and cut to the absolute bone. There is no strategy, very little strategic activity going on, and they haven't managed to grade themselves in the light of the potential of digital tools, notably mapping. So I make the case in the book that planning is pretty arbitrary at the moment, because nobody has an evidence base of what's actually there already. And you couldn't ever level up truly because you haven't got a clue what's there in the first place. And I think that there are forces at work. If you read Guy Shrubsole's book, Who Owns Britain, for example, people don't necessarily want you to know what's there. But in all my research work that we're doing, trying to make transparent maps so you can actually see what's there in the world as a basis of decision making. And we're trying to do this digitally through digital maps, so that maybe one day that they could actually, the aspirations and desires of people could be operationalized through the planning system. Because at the moment they're not. There's virtually no consultation.
No.
You're lucky if 3% is a really high level of engagement on a consultation, and within that 3%, nobody will have looked at whether what backgrounds they come from, or if it's representative or anything like that. It's completely non-existent. This is another research project we're doing. It's very, very flawed. So there really is very little way for people to meaningfully engage with the planning system. So the planning system's cut to the bone, very little democracy within the planning system, and very little investment in the planning system. And we're not working with objective measures, so it becomes arbitrary, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, I've noticed this myself, particularly around issues of consultation, participation. And I was talking to the retired Professor Henry Sanoff, who's written a lot of books on participation. And yeah, it's a most obscure, I mean, it's totally unmeasured. Exactly. It's a system without any metrics. Like, how on earth is anyone to know whether it's any good? All you have to do is do it. And everybody goes, hooray, we did it. And, it's most bizarre. If I was a cynical man, I would say they're doing it on purpose. That it's advantageous to keep participation at arm's length in this way, that sort of declawing of Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. But I'm really kind of interested in how you go from being an architectural historian, which is, I assume, what this work on Le Corbusier comes from, into this activist. Is this a natural progression? Because you don't see many architectural historians getting their hands dirty in kind of political action like this.
Well, I think it's a real opportunity for architectural historians to start. I mean, I love that Rainer Banham term, the historian of the immediate future. Mm-hmm. Now, where does history end and post-occupancy evaluation begin? I think that there's desperate need for histories of practice, not just practice, but also how their business models, their diversity, mm-hmm. how they work themselves. So I think there's a big opportunity for historians. The whole thing. So there I was merrily chucking out books on Le Corbusier, which it was fun to do. But and then a really terrible building. I live in Cardiff. A really terrible building was built up the end of my road, and I complained to the council, and they sent me my complaint to the architect, and the architect wrote back saying good design costs money. And this was a huge turning point for me, because I think good design creates value, all manner of value. And then it got me talking to people, my friends, people doing their house extensions, and to see how poor people just don't value architects at all. They don't see the value of good design. They don't get it. It's really obscure and difficult to understand. And it got me onto a whole journey around how architects talk about what they do and how they communicate with non-architects. And so I had a project on the cultural value of architecture, which morphed into a project on how architects do research on housing. And then that morphed into one on how architects demonstrate their value. And then it's morphed into more recent work on social value and consultation. So it's been very exciting and fun. I see myself as an academic integrator. I like join things up that don't normally talk to each other.
That's a good question, though, and one that I've often wondered about. Were Le Corbusier's buildings quite expensive? Was the Unité Marseille, for example, was that actually proportionally expensive to other social housing kind of models? And how would it compare to social housing these days?
Well, exactly. These are such super fascinating questions that I think historians, how can you really say this building's better than that? What if it was 40 times more expensive? And the Scottish Parliament springs to mind. I was always on the lookout for information about costing. I found it very, very hard. One thing I did discover was that Ronchamp, to build Ronchamp, they had to cut down an entire forest to build Ronchamp, the formwork for Ronchamp. Yeah, so that wasn't good. But then sustainability wasn't. So there were other architects working that time, making churches out of old bed springs and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I mean, Le Corbusier was aware of them, but he felt that what he was up to was so important that it needed that effort, because he was trying to reorient religion around a sort of more feminine, more balance of male and female. And so it needed a bit of drama. But you have to think about Ronchamp. It was actually built out of sort of selling community shares. People don't talk about that. To me, that's super fascinating, selling community shares to make a building like that. And they all believed in it enough to build that building from community shares. So I don't know about the cost of Unité, and believe me, I've tried, and I wish historians would write these things and tell us, It's so good.
But to go back to the book, these two themes of hope and well-being, they're very interesting because they're one of the things. I was doing some research, a little research project with the British Academy on home making during COVID. And it's an ongoing little project that I've been working on. Bit of a nightmare, to be honest, because everybody was locked in their homes. So doing an ethnography around homemaking became quite tricky. But one of the things that I noticed was that there is very little written about home as home. That you get a lot of work in architecture, the glossies, which are about glorious houses for very rich people, or you get sexy books on mass housing that looks good when photographed with a wide-angled lens, and you get the contrast right. And there's one or two architects featured, the Smithsons and so on. But actually trying to describe the experience of home from the perspective of the dweller, of the resident, I found very difficult to find. There's very little there. Would you agree? I mean, you're obviously quite the specialist. Or was I looking in the wrong place?
Well, no, I think I absolutely agree. I mean, one of the chapters in the book, perhaps the chapter in the way I'm most proud of, is about housing knowledge. And the difference. So you get social scientists doing their thing, you get architects doing their thing. Very rarely do they talk to the social scientists. And there are various sectors who have housing knowledge, and you have one sector that's deeply missing from the housing debate is the arts and humanities and literature. And I mean, famous examples like Rachel Whiteread's house. That the home is such a central part of art and literary output, but we don't think about that stuff as part of talking about housing, and let alone capturing people's own experience of their own homes. Maybe that's the territory of anthropologists and ethnographers to some extent. But no, I think it's a very slippery subject, isn't it? It's one about which we all intimately know a lot from our own lived experience, but has been very poorly studied. I mean, one of the reasons that the experience of housing has been so poorly studied is because it's very difficult to make comparisons. You can never compare one bit of housing with another because everything is different. So it's not tidy like hospital or something like that if you actually wanted to study the experience of home. But
you make this case, and you start the book talking about housing studies and how housing studies became sort of dominated by an economistic mindset or a technical mindset through various departments and through the decades of the late 20th century. But you present this, and you've mentioned this already, this idea in that chapter on housing knowledge. You criticize that period. You say, suffice to say, this was a time when natural processes were artificially separated out from spiritual experience and phenomena. And the Enlightenment, in inverted commas, excluded forms of knowledge that didn't fit the mold. And I think this is quite an interesting idea. And these words, hope and well-being, kind of fit within that. They are words about the human spirit. Am I right to think that they are your orientation is towards sort of trying to present a method for measuring the human spirit value of housing rather than just like condensation, mold, ventilation?
If we were society wasn't what it was, you wouldn't need to measure any of this. We would all know that decent housing was what we all need, and it would be happily achieved. But we live in a system where everything has to be measured. And I have a sort of feminist thinking behind my work, which is that you have to quantify and demonstrate things in order for them to be recognized. And then as soon as they have been recognized, you dissolve the quantification and the categories, because you know that quantification and categories never really work. So there's a thing behind it around making these things present. I think that spiritual experience is completely excluded from architectural culture, and I think that this is in this day and age, although there's definitely a change happening. There's a change in the air. And I think that this is very excluding of many different kinds of peoples who do adhere to some spiritual framework in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this sort of totally unspiritualness of architecture culture is actually bordering on getting quite racist in some ways, and can be very, very negative for experience of student architects and things like that.
Yeah.
People like that. So I think there's a real case for acknowledging some people's spiritual lives in talking about housing. I talk about eudaimonic well-being, which for me is it's the highest form of well-being. It's known to be the highest form of well-being. It's the well-being you feel when you feel that you're part of something bigger than yourself, that there's some purpose in things, that they're not completely arbitrary and you're being buffeted about on the winds of fate. So yeah, there is, and hope is a word that is fundamentally religious, because it does not religion in formalized religion, but it's a belief that there is some order to something and things are going in a particular direction. So I put it in there really as a provocation on those fronts, because I think that we have to recognize people's spiritual experience. I think, physics, everything is showing that the world is not what we think it is. And deep ecology and people seeing incredible feeling of connection with the natural world. So so it's a provocation, that word, but it is also I'm very influenced by Rebecca Solnit, who's written a lovely book, Hope in the Dark, and she talks about micro-utopias, just little moments of love and care that happen in the world. We have to give attention to those things. So it's the idea behind the book is that we can be working for something better, something ethically better. And I think I felt, as an architect, somebody who's been in architectural education for 30 years or so, I think when we've got this climate change emergency that we have now, and this is a social justice issue, I cannot countenance people doing PhDs on scrumpled bits of paper that they redraw and then they scrumple it again and they redraw it again, or other PhDs I've seen which have been musical notations that nobody can understand except for the PhD writer. I think there's self-indulgence there. We just don't have space for it right now. But that's my own personal ethos.
No, I think that's really, I think it's true, but I think there's something really wonderful in what you're saying about this idea of, because I've been having a lot of conversations with my wife about this book and this word eudaimonia. She's a philosophy graduate, and she introduced me to this idea many years ago, and it's always been something that sat in the back of my head. To find this idea of eudaimonic housing in your book was really quite lovely, really quite fascinating idea. But I was thinking about this. So these values of hope and well-being are part of a kind of, would you say, part of a kind of decentering of architectural knowledge away from its modernist, postmodernist privileging of a certain, let's be honest, male and largely speaking Western European and American kind of knowledge base. It's about, if we start thinking of architecture through frameworks like hope, which is a virtue, or well-being, which is complex and situated, then we're going to be able to resituate architecture in a way that it will satisfy more people more of the time.
Yes. I mean, yes, well done for summarizing a very complicated issue. I think that's right. And it's not that people do talk a lot about participatory architecture, blah blah blah, and it's great, but nobody really gets to the bottom of why is it good. Why is it good? And for me, it comes back to the fact it's good for people to be able to develop into their own best selves.
Mm-hmm.
have the opportunity and to have to listen to their gut feeling about their journey in life and where they need to be.
And to sort of reflect upon their own motivations as well. I mean, that's one of the things about education, isn't it? Is that you pitch the knowledge back to the learner so that they have to reflect upon it and see where they stand in relation to it. So I guess the same goes for participatory design, is that if you ask people what stuff means to them, what is its value, then they have to, in a way, take ownership of that.
Yes, exactly.
And that's an empowering thing. I mean, this idea that, I think it's quite a modernist idea, but I think you've touched on this already, this idea that good housing could produce well-being and hope. I think I did want you to talk a little bit, like, could you give examples? Like where might we encounter housing that does this? So what does this look like? I mean, obviously it's not one size fits all. Obviously it's locational and situated, but where might we see this? Is there good examples, or are there examples of this starting to happen? The frameworks that will make this more likely to occur starting to be implemented?
Yeah, well, I mean, I talk a lot about the co-housing movement, which is completely squished by the way that planning and policy work at the moment. But where you start seeing it working well, and we have done some sort of bits of study around it, it does seem to start to deliver on this kind of thing. But the only problem with co-housing as it stands is it's very lacking in diversity, because it's so difficult to get into. So it kind of appeals to a certain sector of society. And the level at which people are involved in the making of their housing, well, that's a very thorny problem. I've got PhD students working in that zone as well.
Yeah.
Because that has to be very carefully done. So I think you will find, I mean, the cover of the book has got Marmalade Lane by Cambridge, which by all accounts, people are pretty happy there.
Yeah.
But it's obviously a very affluent part of town.
I did wonder about that. I've never really dug around it, because, it is visually pretty good, isn't it? And it makes you think, like, why doesn't it happen more? So it's to do with these kind of barriers to inclusion, that, as they're called these days, which is economics?
Well, it is. I mean, I've talked in the book about my own journeys of trying to set up a community-led housing with my daughter and her friends, and how, if it's not planning or land or money, it's impossible. It is pretty much impossible. And I'm just and our group and many others are just sitting there waiting for the time that the laws become more sensible around this zone, that will actually allow people to get up and make their own homes and housing. Because things obviously just work so badly for them at the moment. But I mean, there are many examples, historical and more recent, of great housing that really works. But we haven't done a strand of my work is on post-occupancy evaluation, and on average, it's something like only 6% of buildings or something like that ever get any attention. So we don't really know what housing works the best. That's the problem. So quite a lot of it has to be done sort of extrapolated in some kind of way. So I couldn't categorically say to you that Lilac in Leeds was actually making everybody a lot happier, because, well, actually, they probably have done studies on themselves. But they're odd buildings, like, apparently the Unité in Marseille was really fantastic during the pandemic. It was a great place to live, and people did do research on that and showed that it really worked well for them. But the Unité in Marseille now has got a very kind of relatively homogenous kind of group of people living in it. So they're very complex issues, these ones. But for me, it always comes back to giving people the best choice, the best opportunity to be themselves. And I mean, the housing situation in Britain, there is no choice, is there?
No.
We're absolutely trapped.
So these two issues of well-being and hope are tied up with ideas of freedom. And freedom is procured socially through democracy. And you kind of present a mechanism for improving democratic engagement. For example, automation in planning. Is that kind of right? Is it about freedom? Is it about this kind of? Does eudaimonia emerge from freedom? Eudaimonic housing.
Autonomy, power over your is recognised incredibly important part of well-being. To feel in charge of your own destiny, so to speak. Planning certainly has a role to play with this. I mean, my interest in maps and social value is that we're getting to a situation where more and more councils, for example, Newham, are using participatory budgeting to make decisions about their places. We're moving towards citizens' assemblies. I think a feeling that representative democracy is not working. Elected members are not working. We have to find other ways of making decisions. And I think while doing things, if they are democratic, I mean, I'm not an expert on democracy. This is a whole other sphere. Far be it from me to say this, but I would know that if I felt that some kind of transparent and fair process had been gone through to get to a decision about something, I would feel a lot better about all the injustices that have happened in my own neighbourhood.
Yeah.
If I could see that I was actually the only outlier person who actually cared about something, and actually people did want something different. But then it's all predicated on decent public information, and the public had no access to that at the moment.
No, it's really interesting, isn't it? I did a postdoc in Glasgow, which was looking at new tenement style housing of that Scottish type, and there were other case studies in Austria and Berlin. And the research assistant out there had the easiest job possible in Vienna, because he just went and typed in the names of the houses into their planning system. And all of the details, including all of the drawings, architects, dates, reviews, media, everything was there. And there was me going around on my bicycle in Glasgow, finding these new, postmodern tenement housing, and then trying to engage with the planning system, which was unsearchable.
Exactly.
And so you're just left with this kind of completely skewed the research in a way, because what the Glasgow wing of that research became was buildings that we can find stuff out about, versus in Vienna and Berlin, the best buildings.
Exactly. So I did a research project on, part of a team working on why average housing is so bad in Britain, and to some extent, and actually trying to find out about the housing development down your road is very, very hard. And there's so much churn in the construction industry. People have left. They don't care. They design things because they know they're never going to be held accountable. And one of the things I say in the book is that, we need a big plaques outside saying this was built by X. And I think I could argue for a digital register, so every house has its history, what was done to it, so that the next person can sort of build into it. And ultimately that digital register could combine with all the other ones and kind of give big data to the local authority on all manner of things, so it can make more sensible decisions. But information is, partly because the private-public division of things is just ridiculous. And, an example of that is that nobody really knows what cables are running underneath the ground. And I think Atkins have been charged with making a map of underground cables because they all sit with different organisations and nobody knows. So it is really, nobody knows and nobody cares, and nobody will be around enough to be asked the question.
No.
And anyway, many of these, we discovered that a build life, people talk about temporary architecture, but a build life can be as little as 7 years these days. So how long should it, we talked about basic levels of consultation. There aren't any, and that's one thing we're working on at the moment. But what is a basic expectation in terms of how long a house will last?
7 years?
That was, well, yes, the Severa I was working with, that was the shortest build life she'd come across.
That they expected the building to be unfit for human habitation after 7 years. That's worse than a moped. As an obscure measure, but that is interesting, isn't it? Because when you try and sell a car, if you haven't got all the documents, the price comes down massively.
Exactly.
And it seems rather remiss, if at best, that we wouldn't have the same kind of system in place. Basically, that's a lovely idea of creating a diary or a kind of a history of your building. It's a really elegant idea, and it would be very, very useful. I was wondering whether, just to finish up, where you see how might we go about reframing education, architectural education, but also architectural practice in relation to an idea of hope and well-being as something to aim for, that rather than just money. Like, how do we do this? Like, how do we start the conversation, and how do then we start implementing these things to undergraduates, not just to postgraduates? So it's easy to persuade postgraduates of anything, but undergraduates are the ones where we've got to kind of win the battle. Partly because I think most students of architecture don't actually become architects. So we're sending them out into the world sort of, if we think we've got if we've got 5 years to teach them the truth, and they leave at 3, then kind of they're escaping before we've given them the punchline. Like, how do we invest young learners in this idea?
Well, when we started the school at Reading, we did a piece on education for uncertainty, and I think we have to, which was arguing for helping students to become researchers, so that in a way, whatever problem came their way, they knew how to tackle it, or had or who to ask at the very least.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting, all the work on the ethics that's been going on in the RIBA recently, because if taken to its logical extreme, you would have an ethical duty to be producing hope and well-being with anyone that came in your orbit of your practice. And I'm waiting. There's a Healthy Homes Bill which is chugging through Parliament at the moment, and I mean, if that got through, all manner of things could change. But in terms of, I have a chapter in the book on professional transformation. Really, I believe that I think a lot of people leave architecture because, and I certainly got out of practice because it was, well, I was there in a recession, because I was vastly overtrained, a bit like you say, Ambrose, you've been through. But actually architecture practice is incredibly mind-numbingly tedious, and very, very little intellectual content in there whatsoever. And research makes architecture practice so much more exciting, research and innovation. But what I think a lot of architecture will be automated, humdrum and repetitive stuff will be automated. And the rest of it will come. Architects will have to become these people who choreograph these platforms for people to make their own things, and to design their own things, and to get involved in their own placemaking. So I think the Centre for Digital Britain calls these things ontologists, people who bring things together and help others to do things themselves. So I think there will be a lot more in that zone. But I think there will also be architectural practice, which is incredibly what's the word? Sensory, real, face-to-face and personal, and that nothing digital could ever do. And architecture will be recognized as a kind of experiential transformation. The work of people like Piers Taylor and Invisible Studio spring to mind there. And so I think that there will be very different kind of things that architects are going to have to learn. And potentially bifurcational, maybe there'll be hybrid services around those areas. I wonder if the word architect will continue. I think that things will coalesce more around certain kinds of services that they do, because they will be very specialized. And it's interesting, people like Carl Turner architects changed their name to Turner Works, because actually the word architect turns people off. And so I think, yeah, it comes back to, I argue in the book that people need to get very, very familiar with financial systems. I mean, I think students really feel disempowered by the lack of financial knowledge that they have to either become developers themselves or to help other organizations make things happen, or to get money from charities or research councils or whatever it is. I think understanding money is really, really important. Understanding data is really important, to be able to use data in an effective way to counter the negative forces that we live in. And I think,
yes, because they've certainly got the data.
Yeah, well, they haven't. I mean, no, it's not. They haven't got the data. No, it's a complete mess, the whole data. But there's a lot of work going on in Britain to get data in the right direction, so that we could actually correlate one bit with another and actually make a sensible decision out of it. And then I think there's a something around working practices of architects, that a decent, we should be expecting a decent environment, decent working practices, decent hours, decent pay. That needs to be inculcated within schools, lack of exploitation and all these sorts of things. It's a kind of different kind of working conditions. And I think, you might say, who's going to pay for all of this, going out into the world? But I do believe that banks and funders are really worried about social risk and unrest. And there are a lot of people queuing up to invest their money in green shares, green endeavours, all these kinds of things, community shares. And I think that if we could only get the banks, they're already doing it. Banks and funders offer favourable rates of interest to environmental and sustainable and socially sustainable developments. But the data that those are truly sustainable and social is a bit flawed right now. And we need to create a golden thread that, yes, we are doing good projects. Our data shows that they're good, and therefore you can fund us with confidence, and that will get more money back into the system to do good things. I think ultimately that's what I'm arguing, because at the moment it just doesn't work. And architects and others are not making a very good case for why they are worth paying more and why they are worth bringing into the fold.
Yeah.
So there's something around, and I'm not an expert in finance, but I know there's an opportunity there for architects and others, if they were to get their brains around it and be clever. And likewise, the planning system. I'm very fond of an Anthony Giddens quote, which is around constraints make you more creative. And I believe in student projects and everything they do.
Have you come across Alistair Parvin and Open Systems Lab, who are working on through WikiHouse and through Architecture 00? It's another project of Architecture 00, looking at exactly this idea of user interaction, citizen interaction with planning through open source software and things like that. It's very, very fascinating. But you also are setting up an urban room in Cambridge, which is one of the areas I thought that. Do you see that as a mechanism for kind of starting to build a civic discourse from the very beginning around the value of the urban environment and ultimately around the value of the home?
Well, yes, definitely. So there's a growing network of urban rooms across the UK. And when I was head at Sheffield, we set one up there. Was
that the first one?
No, it wasn't the first one, I don't think. It was one of the first ones. I mean, it depends. But that's been going since 2016. And for me, an urban room is a place for citizens or the public, university, practice, industry to come together and talk about the future of their places, really, and do research together on the future of their places. And so that in my research work, that we've been creating urban rooms in various places to experiment how best people like to interact. And people don't want to just interact digitally; they want the face-to-face environment for talking and the real human interaction that brings. sometimes people say to me, "Oh, but what about architecture centres? They were, like that, weren't they?" But I think architectures were directed at architects. They were full of, books on architecture and I don't know, things that architects like to buy. But the urban room is a very different and very raw place, really, and to be developed together as people want it to be.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. I think it's a very lovely book, and I'm very grateful for very interesting. I think it might be a turning point. You talked earlier about there are green shoots, and there is this growing movement for what you called a sensory architecture. Maybe this book, I was saying to my wife this morning, I don't know what paradigm shifts look like, but maybe this is the beginning, another part of the beginning of this paradigm shift of a new form of architecture and a new form of practice, a new form of education of architects, which is hopeful.
Well, I think a lot of people are working in this zone, and that's what I wanted to bring, a lot of examples of all people who are doing that. So I think it is a real shift, and I think we need to make it known. And I think there's a hunger for it amongst our students as well, because they're very committed to these issues too.
Fabulous. What a lovely point to finish on. Thank you very, very much, Flora.
Thank you very much indeed, Amrose. Great talking with you.
A manifesto and a mood. Great stuff from Flora. Thank you to her and to Routledge for the ebook. It's an excellent read, a call to arms in truth for greater care. Have a look at the podcast description where there are links to it, buy it and learn, and to other stuff Flora has done and is involved in, and her professional and social profiles. And please do share this episode. And thanks for listening. Cheers.